right. Again, thank you guys for joining us today. So what we're seeing a lot in our environment, as well as in the world in general, is we see a lot of people starting to make the choice to start, either looking at some of the cloud-based calling services like Microsoft, Zoom, WebEx, or some people, already getting ready to start moving over to some of what we call the big three over here at Variphy. So what we have a lot of people do is looking for some assistance with that. They're trying to get an understanding of their current environment. What needs to move? How should I move it? Trying to build migration plans. And as they're working with a lot of their VARs, they're getting information on how the call manager is configured, what their, how many devices they have, users they have, what needs to be migrated, what doesn't need to be migrated. But we're seeing there's a lot of gaps in a lot of just general information. The call manager is great. It's going to tell you configuration information. You can run as-built reports and things like that to see how it's configured. But a lot of what we're seeing is lack of actual data to back up some of the information. And a great analogy somebody told me, which really kind of resonated, was that, when you're getting ready to move your house, you don't want to pay the movers to move the garbage. You want to clean out your house first and then pay the movers to move just what you want to keep. And that's really resonated because essentially that's what a lot of people are looking to do is they're looking to say, hey, in my call manager, I know how it's configured. I have reports on how it's configured, but what am I actually using? What is it actually doing? They're really trying to make, educated and data-driven decisions on what they actually need to bring over, not just what's necessarily configured. So they're coming to us. How do we do that? How can Variphy help with that migration? So today we're going to spend a little bit of time just walking through some of the reports that we've worked with on our customers to help them identify, some of their migration paths and their plans, but also helping understand, okay, what phones do we have that are cloud capable? What phones do I actually need to move versus what phones are programmed in my call manager and have just been sitting there or not being used? Do I need to bring those over? In other words, we see a lot of call managers that have been running for years and years and years, and they've changed hands multiple times. So there's, for lack of a better word, garbage that needs to be cleaned up. So this won't be all the reports that we've run with people, but these are some of the key ones we run with some of our folks doing migrations. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. The first one I'm going to talk a little bit about is dormancy. And that is understanding what phones I have programmed in my environment that just aren't being used. In other words, I may have 1,000 devices, I may have 20,000 devices. Out of all of those devices, they're programmed, they're set up in my call manager, but if they're not being used, do I really need to pay for WebEx license for those? Or do I need to pay for Zoom license or MS Teams license for those phones? So let's start off with a dormancy report. So for this, I'm going to go ahead and move away from our history search, although you can accomplish exactly what I'm going to do here out of history search. And if you know me, I love the history search screen. I build all my reports there. But for today, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm just going to move us right into the report section. Same concept, but we're going to kind of start from scratch. So I'm moving over to the reports, and I'm going to come over here and click Create a Report. So we're going to give this guy a name, and we'll just call it Dormancy by, well, let's call it Dormancy dormant phones. And yes, you can do this by users as well if your call manager is set up in more of a user configuration. But we're going to go ahead and get this guy kicked off with phones because we see most people coming to us asking, look, I've got 10,000 phones. I know we're not using 10,000 phones. Can you tell us which ones aren't being used? So we're going to start off. We're going to give this guy a name called dormant phones. The next thing we need to do is we're going to need to define what we're searching for. In other words, what do we want to bring back on this report? And in this case, we're focusing on our phones. Couple different ways that you can do this. You can focus in on things like device types. Although with device types, it gets pretty particular down to models of phones. I think that's a little bit more work than it needs to be. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and focus in on the device names. And because we want to see dormancy, in other words, we want to see if a call received or placed a call throughout our time period, we're going to go ahead and start with our originating and terminating device name. And from here, we're going to add the prefix of our devices. Now, there's really only about 6 prefixes for devices. There's like IPC for your IPC phones. There's starts with SEP for your hard phones. There's things like your Jabber and Android devices, so we can add things like BOT in here. And we've only got about 4 more, so I'm going to get the last of these guys in here just so everybody's got a good view of kind of really what would encompass all of your calling devices. There's your tab devices, and then let's say starts with, and what am I missing here? I've got my IPC, my bot, my tab. Oh, yeah, don't forget your CFS devices. And let's see, what do I got here? IPC, my TCT devices. All right, this is pretty much, depending on your environment, and this is probably overkill for most environments, but this is pretty much going to encompass all of your device names for any of your hard and soft devices. So if there's certain things in your that you don't want, like let's say, hey, we don't use Jabber for tablet or anything like that, we can remove certain values and get those out of there. But this is a pretty good base for encompassing pretty much all your phone devices. Right. The next thing we're going to do is now we set our search. We said we're going to bring back call records for all of these phones. But essentially what we're looking for is we don't really want to see ones with call records. We want to see ones without call records. So for that, we're going to go to the grouping section and we're going to enable data grouping. And we're just going to group off the same thing we're searching on. And those are those devices, both originating and terminating devices. This is going to basically output all of the devices originating or terminating by device name. Now, I do like to sort this by count highest to lowest. You don't necessarily have to, because really we're bringing back all phones that don't have any calls. So you can actually just leave this as name and label, and it's going to be fine. It's just going to put them in alphabetical order. Right. The next thing we do is, and the key to this report is understanding that what we want out of this report is we want to see the phones that have a maximum primary grouping count of 0. All right. So if I put a 1 in here, this is going to come back and say, only show me phones that have 1 call. If I put a 2 in here, this is going to say, hey, only bring me back, I'm sorry, 1 or more. Only bring me back phones that have 2 or more. This is my maximum primary grouping count, or I'm sorry, 2 or less. But we don't care if they've got 2 calls, or we don't care if they have 1 call. We want to make sure they have 0 calls. Now, another thing that we do is a lot of times people will say they'll run this for 6 months. They may run this report for a year, and they're going to be like, you know what? Rather than looking at just the 0 calls, I may want to see people that in a year have only had 3 calls or 10 calls or 20 calls. You can leverage this field to kind of minimize and whittle that list down. So it's not just for looking for people that had, or phones that had 0 calls. You could also set yourself a threshold to say, you know what? Maybe if they've had 20 calls in 6 months, I could save some money by not migrating this phone over, and maybe incorporate it into a workspace or a common space or something like that, depending on your platform. So this is again, stressing this guy, this is a key to what you want to get out of this report. If you're looking for ones that have 0 calls, then you're popping a 0 in here. If you're just looking for someone that say has a certain threshold of calls within a certain amount of time, then you're going to want to put that threshold in there. Right. So from there, I'm going to go ahead and scroll down, and I really don't care about average duration, average call, ring time, any of that. None of these calls have any of these phones have calls. So I'm just going to leave that as total count. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of my search sets. I'm not looking for a count of all of my telephone calls. I don't need that. I'm really just looking for that grouping. So I'm going to turn off the search set statistics. I'm also going to turn off the detail. We don't need that. And obviously cradle to grave, you're not going to use that. And we're going to give this guy a name, and let's go ahead and run this. And we're going to do our dormant phones webinar. So now when we run this, we're going to get to pick the time frame we want to run this report on. So I'm going to run this in a CSV format. You can run it in HTML, PDF, Excel, just depends on how you want to use it. In this case, I'm using this as a CSV because I want to go ahead and look at what some of these phones are and determine, do these actually need to move? So we're going to leave this as CSV, and I'm going to go ahead and run this. We'll run this for the current quarter and see what we get here. So essentially what this report is doing, and that came back fast, essentially what this report is doing is it's essentially looking at all of the call data there. And give me 1 second. Let me pop that guy over here. That popped up on my other screen. Yeah, where did it go? And of course, it's going to hide somewhere in my downloads. Nope, hold on. We can do this. Let's go to our repository. And we'll just pull that guy up again. I'm not quite sure where he went. And let's go ahead and take a look at this guy here. Let's see what we get. There we are. Well, that guy didn't return any results. Bear with me 1 second here. Why don't you have, there we go. Let's pop it back into that guy here. Dormant phones, that was the right one. And let's look at this guy here. I'm going to run our template for dormant phones here. And essentially, this is the same thing. Now, this is actually a good exercise because I just walked through creating that report right there. Now, the nice thing about this is you guys don't have to create this. If you pop over to our website, you can actually just download this report and it's already set up and ready to go. And I see what I forgot here. Rather than using the call history search, I should have changed over to the grouping search and re-added my search criteria. So let me pop back over to this guy. And what I'm talking about here is under the grouping option. Right now, I'm grouping off a call history detail. That won't work because our calls don't have any call history detail. All right, makes sense. Now, if I change this to 1, we can group off a call history detail because now I have detail. But in my case, I'm strictly looking for calls that have no call history detail. So the problem with my report is it did exactly what I said it should do. I said, bring me back all phones based off a call history detail, and I don't have any call history detail, so it brought me back a blank report. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to do this the right way, and we're just going to re-add our devices in here. And we'll call this devices. And then we're going to go ahead and do this, basically just repeat the same filter that we had over there before. And we're going to add our TCT devices and do starts with. And starts with our SCP devices. And we'll do a couple more here, our bot devices. And let's do our IPCs, forgot those. Our tab devices. And last but not least, our CSF devices. So essentially what we're saying is we want to group off of these categories instead of call history detail because, again, there is no call history detail. So let's rerun this guy here and get what we want. All right, so while this guy is running, what it's essentially doing is it's going through the call detail. Let's see if this guy will open up. It's going through the call detail. And it is finding all of the phones that are in call detail. All right, so the first thing, step 1, it grabs all the call detail. It makes a list of every phone that matches in your call detail. The second thing it does is it then goes through your call manager and it grabs a list of all your phones. Then it essentially cross compares the two lists and it says, show me all the phones that didn't appear in list 1. And essentially what we've got here is exactly that. This is a complete list of phones in my phone system for the current quarter that have not had any call volume. Now, the nice thing about this is if I was doing a WebEx cutover or a Zoom cutover or a Teams custom or a cutover, and I'm only looking at my call manager configurations, these are all programmed in my call manager. These are things that I could be paying somebody to be moving over that I don't actually need. So this is a great way to be able to help save some money during your cutover, but also eliminate that clutter because, again, the last thing you want to do is move the garbage over to your new house. All right, so that's one report that we see a lot of folks using. It's extremely handy and something that it's saving a lot of people a lot of money. The next thing I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about is something that we've talked about quite a bit before, and that's capacity. Now, one thing you may say is, well, do I really need to worry about capacity, because now I'm switching over to a different platform. Maybe you're switching carriers. Maybe you're not switching carriers. Fact of the matter is, yes, you do still have to worry about capacity because you pay your carrier for capacity. So whether you're switching over to a new service or not, you may be bringing your carrier over. You may be going with a carrier that they're providing. Just depends on the size of your organization and what you're doing. So capacity is still important. Now, one of the things that we see, unfortunately, is that a lot of folks that they, when they originally, paid their carrier and bought their lines through their carrier and their carrier gave them, maybe 200 concurrent call capacity or 500, depending on the size of your organization. They've kind of migrated that. And throughout the years, as their call managers have changed, they haven't really looked at it or changed the capacity or what they're paying their carrier. We find a lot of customers that'll do this exercise. And essentially what they find out is for a long time, they may have been paying a lot more money than they really needed to. So capacity is basically looking at how many concurrent calls are going on at once. And it used to be a lot more popular and people used to think about it more when you were using PRIs and T1s and things like that. And you had 23 channels and that's all you could do. And how close were we getting to that? But as people moved to SIP, they stopped really focusing on it. They weren't really looking at it too much. However, it's just important now as it was before, not necessarily from a call drop perspective, but that's still important. But it comes down to what you're paying your carrier for. And if you're paying your carrier for 500 channels, but you can see you're only using 150 at most throughout the year, do you really need that high of a carrier bill? So we've saved tens of thousands of dollars for a lot of customers using the capacity reports, and a lot of people are really starting to take a look at this as they're starting to move towards their new vendors, because again, they're starting to look at some things that they can clean up. So we're going to give this report a name here, and we're going to go to our search sets. Now, depending on your environment, in this case, I'm just going to use SIP gateways because we're a SIP gateway house over here. So depending on your environment, you may have to look at this from different angles. You may have to look at this from like device names if you're using like PRIs or T1s. If you're using SIP, the easiest way I like to look at this is if you come to the search menu, you can search for originating or terminating CUCM device type. I talked a little bit about this when we were looking at the phones, and for phones, it's not super intuitive because it's got every model of phone. However, when you're looking at your SIP trunks, all you have to do is put in SIP trunk. Essentially what this guy is doing now is just going to go through my call manager and pull out all of the SIP trunk information. So that's the only search criteria I need to add here. But the cool thing is, and the key to this guy is going down to my grouping section. Now we have multiple SIP trunks. So again, for our grouping, we're going to focus in on that originating or terminating device name. All right. This is going to give us the name of your SIP trunk. All right. Now, we're not going to do anything here this time because we are looking for call detail. We want to know how many concurrent calls are going on. We're going to keep this on call history because this time we do have call history. But I tell you what we don't need this time is I don't need a total count of how many calls are going in and out of my SIP trunks. I'm going to get that, but I can toggle that whole guy off. What I am going to toggle on is this one right here. All right. That's the top one under the grouping concurrent calls activity. All right. What this is going to do is it's going to give me a very nice, clean looking summary of what each of my SIP trunks is doing. All right. We're going to go ahead and toggle off our search set statistics because, like, again, I don't need to know of total volume. I really just want to see capacity utilization at all of my SIP trunks. And we don't need call detail, and obviously cradle to grave is off. So let's go ahead and save this guy, and we'll search for our webinar here. And there's our capacity utilization webinar. So I'm going to run this guy. We're going to kick him off, and we'll kick him off for the same time period. We'll do the, what are we doing? The current quarter. And essentially what this guy is doing is now aggregating all of the calls in my entire call manager cluster. It is looking at each call row. It is looking at the start times, in other words, the connection times and the disconnection times of each particular one. And it is determining when there is overlap to show you how many calls are going on at any given time. Not just from a total count perspective, but from a capacity perspective. So, oh, you know what? I ran that one in Excel. Well, we can show it to you in Excel, but I like this one in PDF a little bit more. All right, so essentially what we have here is we have my two SIP gateways. This is my stream capacity. I programmed this in my Variphy system under the configuration menu and under my CDR devices. So I programmed my capacity there. Once I program my capacity, it will give me percentages. But regardless if you program your capacity or not, you will still get your peak utilization. So in this case, what this report is showing me is that this particular SIP gateway right here, at most, I peaked at 5 calls going on at once. That peak lasted for 4 minutes and 28 seconds. So this guy right over here, this is again my secondary SIP trunk, or this is my primary, this is my secondary. This one I peaked at 13 calls going on at once. That peak lasted for 11 seconds. So now if I'm looking at this, and let's say I have capacity with my carrier for 50 concurrent calls, well, I may be a little bit over trunked, although 50 is not bad. I mean, this guy I hit 13, this guy I hit 5. I've only got one carrier, so my carriers using both of those. So again, 50 may not be too bad, but if I'm paying for 200, I am way over capacity, and I could save a lot of money by bringing my carrier capacity down and changing some of my calling plans. Right. Again, great report. We see a lot of people using this to really make the determinations on what they want to do, and it's a great way to save some money. So even if you aren't in the middle of a migration or you guys are thinking about a migration, this is a great report to save yourself some money. See what you guys do versus what you guys are paying for. Like I said, we've saved customers tens of thousands of dollars by looking at some of these values because they just haven't looked at them for years. Now, some of the other ones that we do, and I'm going to talk a little bit about these at a high level, are things like understanding your outbound usage. Okay, we've got so many phones. I need to know what does my outbound calling look like? In other words, do all of my people need an external line? In other words, do they need to place outbound calls? Well, how do you know? The call manager doesn't tell you if those people are placing outbound calls. It really only tells you if they have a phone and call manager. So another quick report that we run with a lot of folks is being able to focus in on outbound calling. So now how do we do that? Easy way to do that is one, I could focus in on my terminating device name, and I could put my SIP trunks in there. I could put my SIP trunk queued primary like this guy and just pop that guy in there. Now you'll notice I'm focusing on my terminating device name. All right. The reason that I'm focusing on my terminating device name is because that signifies the call is terminating there. In other words, I want to see the calls terminating at my Cube gateway. Other ways that we can do this is we could say, oh, you know what? The other thing that we can focus in on, rather than focusing in on gateways or anything like that, is a lot of times, depending on your dial pattern, you may have 4-digit extensions. You may have 8-digit extensions or 7-digit extensions. You could always do something like this, where you're going to put 10 digits in here, or 10 X's. Oh, how many did I get there? And just say ends with. This is, for me, can isolate all of my outbound calls because I know any outbound call will be at least 10 digits. So these are simple ways to isolate some outbound calling. You could combine these, and I can leave both of these in there, or I can get rid of one and just say, hey, one works better in my environment than the other. But these are just a couple ways to isolate outbound calls. Then from there, we want to do our association. What callers are calling outbound? One, I could do that by the calling party number, and it's going to give me the extensions. I could do that by my users, my end user IDs, or my first names and last names if your organization uses first names and last names. I could also do it by the device name or device description, depending on what your organization uses. Again, I'm going to use originating device name, and we'll just stick with MAC addresses. And in this case, I want to see the total volume, average call duration, total call duration. And now maybe I say I only want to see people that have a maximum primary grouping type of 10. In other words, let's go ahead and say they've got a maximum of 10 calls. We can leave that at 10, and that's going to say only show me people that are above 10 calls or more. Or I can say, you know what, only show me them if they've had a minimum number of calls of 5, and that will show me only people that have had a minimum amount of calls for 5. In this case, I just want a list of all people that placed outbound calls. Pretty straightforward. Again, I'm not trying to summarize on how many outbound calls I have. I don't care. I really just want to get this list, and I don't need detail. So we'll give this guy a name, outbound callers webinar. And again, the purpose of this report right here is, again, it really goes ahead and highlights and helps you plan what you guys want to be doing for your cutover. What do you want to be paying for? If I have 1,000 people or 2,000 people or 10,000 people in my organization, do they all need a license with my carrier for outbound calling? So this report's going to output that information and give you a nice list of all folks that have had outbound calls, and there we go. I could filter this down a little bit more. It looks like I've got some analog gateways in here. These are likely our fax machines. So any number of ways to be able to filter this down. But again, a great money-saving report. Now, we did this for outbound. This could also be done for things like international calls. So you pay your carrier for international plans. Well, who should have an international plan? If you're just taking apples to oranges, what's in Call Manager, is that still pertinent? Great way to be able to help isolate that. Other great reports that we build, and again, if you guys have questions about some of these reports, give us a holler. We're happy to work with you guys on these, are things like building out your migration plan. In other words, how do you know what departments or banks or branches or institutions to migrate first? Well, you can throw a dart at a dartboard and say, well, let's just go with that guy. Or you can guess and say, we think we have this part of my organization doesn't have a lot of calls, so we can trial, this particular feature with them. Or you can run a verify report that's going to give you concrete data, sort it by like your device pools, your departments, or any number of different ways of sorting, and get an actual list, a data-driven list of how you want to build that migration plan based on the volume of calls going to those particular branches or parts of that organization. So a lot that you can do there. And I'm going to go ahead and wrap, but I am going to go ahead and show one more report that has been huge for our migration customers, and that is all those people wondering, hey, are my phones cloud capable? Out of all these phones that I have in my organizations, thousands of phones, which ones can I actually bring over to the cloud? Which ones are cloud capable? So our as-built report has been used a ton for that. So under our as-built report, you'll see a report for IPC. And if we scroll through here, you're going to see it under the devices. And where did it go? IP serial phone number, firmware, and CDP information. This is a huge report. I'm not going to run it. I'm going to go ahead and show you an example just because I know we're out of time. But let me bring up what this report looks like here. Let's not save that guy. This report is going to go through and it is going to scan through all of your call manager, pull out all of your phones. But what you're going to notice here off to the right are these columns. You're going to see the serial number. You're going to be able to get the firmware off of the phone. You're going to be able to get the version ID as well as the hardware revision. This is the information you're going to need to determine whether those phones in your organization are cloud capable. So this has been huge and saved a lot of money because people aren't needing to buy a lot of phones. But what they do need to know is which ones can support the cloud, WebEx or Zoom or MS Teams. This is how you're going to be able to get that information without having to physically find the box for every single phone that you've got out there.